So for the Chinese, there is no problem that cannot be solved with yet another bridge, road, highway, hyperscaler, coal plant, home.
I don't buy it at all.
Okay.
In part because Wang himself talks about the Roosevelt administration as being full of lawyers who are capable of building things, right? So China is still very much geared to a political framework that revolves around the idea of economic development. Mm-hmm. It remains a relatively poor country once you get away from the larger cities, and there are still massive challenges as far as servicing and creating opportunities for hundreds of millions of its people.
大家好，今天要分享的是澳大利亚学者沃维克·鲍威尔一段访谈的节选。在这段采访中，鲍威尔对加拿大华裔学者王丹的“中国是工程国家，美国是律师社会”这个观点做了批驳。王丹试图以领导群体的职业背景来解释中美两国的治理逻辑，并分别指出了各自的利弊。这个观点乍一听似乎有些道理，符合两国国家治理的一些表面特征，比如中国近年来以基础设施建设推动发展的模式十分显著，而美国政治精英中律师比例较高也是事实。但鲍威尔指出，这种二元对立的框架过于简化，甚至带有误导性，无法真正揭示国家治理模式的复杂本质。沃维克·鲍威尔是澳大利亚昆士兰科技大学教授，同时也是一位知名的社会影响专家。鲍威尔对中国有很多正面评价，他认为中国的空前经济增长及其国际化是全球转型的关键催化剂，赞扬中国在不发动战争、不进行掠夺性扩张的情况下，实现了国家经济和社会的巨大发展，为许多发展中国家提供了启示。鲍威尔还高度评价今年中国93大阅兵，他指出80年来西方将二战改写为欧美胜利史，将中国贬到角逐的地位，而中国的纪念活动正是挑战这种集体失忆，夺回中国作为反法西战争主力军的核心地位。王丹是一位加拿大科技分析师和作家，专注于当代中国研究，擅长从科技角度广泛评论中美关系，包括半导体制造和社交媒体。我上个月曾经发过一篇他参加的访谈节目，有兴趣的朋友可以去看看他对中国科技企业的评价。对王丹和鲍威尔的观点，你有什么样的看法？也请留言评论区。下面我们来看看他们是怎么说的。
I want to actually just put a concept in front of you. It's a conversation that I've noticed online over the last couple of weeks. I just want to get your thoughts on this.
It's the engineering state, which is the way I think about China. I call it the engineering state because at various points in the last few decades, the entirety of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the 9 highest ruling members of the Chinese Communist Party, all of them had degrees in engineering of a very Soviet sort. So these are people who are trained to build, where a mega project is kind of the answer to any number of quandaries that they have. So for the Chinese, there is no problem that cannot be solved with yet another bridge, road, highway, hyperscaler, coal plant, home. And so China is just building its way out of all of its problems. The problem is that they are also fundamentally social engineers. And so they spend a lot of time thinking about how they can engineer the population as well. And so in this book, I spend a lot of time covering the one-child policy as well as zero COVID, which are radical experiments in social engineering and population engineering. I contrast that with the United States, which is also a country where I grew up. Having been a fellow at the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, one of the things that became really apparent to me was that the U.S. is really a country where the government is made by the lawyers, for the lawyers, and of the lawyers. Lawyers have been very deeply entrenched in America since the very founding. So if you take a look at the first 13 American presidents, everyone from Washington to Lincoln, all but 3 of them had practiced law at some point. The Democratic Party today is really full of lawyers, such that between 1980 to 2020, every single vice presidential and presidential nominee by the Democrats had gone to law school before. And the issue with lawyers is that they're really good at saying no. They're really good at blocking things. And so in the lawyerly society, you don't have stupid ideas like the one-child policy. You also don't have very functional infrastructure almost anywhere throughout the country.
When we compare the cultures of, I'd say the East and the West, but really I'm talking about the United States and China. And, the question comes down to infrastructure. Why can China build nationwide high-speed rail, as an example, in less than a decade? Well, California can't build a single route in over 20 years. And this might come down to culture. China operates like a state of engineers. The United States operates like a state of lawyers. And in China, leaders are trained to think like engineers. And the majority of provincial leaders, I believe, are trained in engineering or the natural sciences. And as a result, problems are viewed as technical puzzles to be solved with big projects and executed quickly. And that's why they churn out bridges, rail, factories at breakneck speed. We've all read stories about the dozens of uninhabited ghost cities in China. And I joke that the US government prints money, the Chinese government prints condos. It's a different take on the same kind of stimulus. But if China is a nation of engineers, the United States is dominated by lawyers, and every single Democratic vice president and president since 1980, with the only exception of Al Gore, went to law school. And as a consequence, every big project in the US faces a gauntlet of reviews, lawsuits, and regulations. This slows everything down and kills ambitious ideas. But it also prevents catastrophic overreach and protects individual rights. And this is important. So let me explain why. The engineering mindset that seems to be very prevalent in Chinese politics is carried into social engineering as well. And when you approach social issues like engineering problems, you might end up with disastrous outcomes like the one-child policy or zero COVID. People are more than economic inputs, and overlooking that tends to lead to an abundance of unintended harm. So while China dazzles with speed and scale, but they risk engineering their society into somewhat of a predicaments, America frustrates with delays, but avoids the self-inflicted wounds of social engineering. Do you think what do you think of this summary of Chinese political culture and American political culture, and why these two economies are moving at vastly different speeds? One excels towards building solutions, and one excels towards saying no, which is what lawyers are really, really good at, is blocking things from happening. What's your take, Warwick?
Yeah, this is the Dan Wang argument, right? So
that's right. That's his name. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I don't buy it at all.
Okay.
In part because Wang himself talks about the Roosevelt administration as being full of lawyers who are capable of building things, right? So the idea of this reductive dualist framework that somehow you can reduce national competency to essentially the occupational types of a group of leaders, I think is way too, arguably simplistic, but I think probably more importantly, a little bit misleading in the way that it frames the institutional environment in which different things are prioritized and different kinds of problems are addressed. And there are other examples, so I'll try and just tackle them one by one. China is a country that emerged from 100 years of war with devastated infrastructure, very, very low living standards, and life expectancy of less than 40 years of age. Right, so this was 80 years ago. In that environment, it sought to find ways of solving, social and economic problems in the context of an ambitious revolution at the same time. And it did that through drawing on all sorts of frameworks of dealing with the world. Some of those came from, I guess you'd say, the socialist connections that it had, particularly with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, had a strong background in science, technology, infrastructure, engineering. Now, China had to build things. It didn't have many power stations. It didn't have many roads. Its railway network was, of course, in place, but it needed to be expanded. So it had to learn how to build things anyway. The social aspects, I think, are kind of interesting, right? Because this idea of social engineering as a phrase comes with a lot of baggage, right? But part of the political reactions in the United States today seems to me to be a reaction to a whole bunch of social engineering that a certain political perspective has reacted to. And I'm talking about, views concerning equity and those sorts of things, right? Equity, accessibility, or whatever. The idea that the US somehow hasn't been involved in social engineering in its own way seems a little bit far-fetched. And in fact, I think you could argue that those who have a sensibility to the law are actually well equipped to describe and segment and categorize people in all sorts of ways that lends itself to various forms of classifications. And from that, supports ways in which societies seek to engineer outcomes. For the past 300 years, actually, governments around the world, particularly in Europe to start off with, and in more recent times, China has sought to view the population as a resource. Right? So, and it has done that through the interventions of providing things like education. Sunday schools. Why were Sunday schools introduced? Well, partly to ensure that working class people could read and write, working class kids. Why did that have to happen? Well, because they needed to have them work in factories. Why was there the emergence of public health initiatives? Well, not because there was anything particularly kind about the world, but because there was an attempt to engineer a capable and healthy workforce to go and work in industry. So there has always been an attempt to engineer outcomes concerning populations. Sometimes they've been explicit. So if you took the one-child policy, which is the one that Dan Wang uses in the book, he describes it as his favourite chapter. The one-child policy was implemented for about 30-odd years. And was it a case of social engineering? Let's put the pejorative rhetoric aside and let's understand the context, I guess, of this policy response. That policy emerged in an environment where there were concerns about adequacy of food to feed people, concerns about the adequacy of medicine to deal with people as they got sick. So there was some genuine concerns at the time that China did not have the ability to actually deal with a rapidly growing population, number one. In bringing population growth in check at that time, remember, it was dealing with certain kinds of problems. At that time, it created the foundations demographically that enabled it to then experience the last 40 years of economic growth that it did. There are, of course, consequences to that, and we all know what they are, which is an imbalance, gender imbalance in society. And also, there's no doubt that in parts of the country, zealous implementation of policies led to some very bad experiences for many women. Okay, so all of that's also true. But what Wang kind of doesn't really mention is the fact that up until the 1970s, the United States actually sanctioned eugenics-based programs that were based on race, which was to sterilize people on racial terms. So, who was social engineering whom and why? My point really is that I think these dualisms don't help us understand places that well. China has been compelled through its circumstances and its way of thinking about its economic development and social development problems and challenges to address this issue of infrastructure deficit. In Chinese thinking, there has long been a saying that if you want a place to get rich, you need to build roads first. Because if you can't connect places, to other markets, you're never going to be able to create wealth, right? So isolated villages in the middle of nowhere in the mountains don't get wealthy because you can't get things to them and they can't get their things to market. So it's a big, complicated country. Complicated meaning that it's geographically and topographically really complicated. Deserts, mountains, big rivers, gorges. It's and lowlands. It has plenty of earthquakes. It floods. Does all of this stuff. So it invariably, if it has an ambition to develop, it has to become good at certain things. The fact that the leadership, the cadre, have engineering and science backgrounds, I think speaks a lot more to a sensibility, particularly in that 1950s, 1960s period, which was, we're a poor country. We've got to build stuff. We need to know stuff. We've got a population that dies on average at the age of 39, right? So we need to actually get our heads around medicine. We need to get our heads around roads, rails, bridges. We need to get our heads around energy. And I suspect that it's got a lot more to do with that than just some idea that, China's a bunch of engineers and America's not. I guess the last thing I'll say on this, Jay, is that I think this has a lot more to do with, two things. Firstly, I think it has a lot to do with the ways in which national leaders now frame problems and what their priorities are. So China is still very much geared to a political framework that revolves around the idea of economic development. Mm-hmm. It remains a relatively poor country once you get away from the larger cities, and there are still massive challenges as far as servicing and creating opportunities for hundreds of millions of its people. When China says that it's raised 800 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 30 to 40 years, we have to remember that that's from a population of 1.4 billion people. We're talking about 600 other million people as well, right? But bringing 800 million people out of extreme poverty does not mean yet that we have 800 million middle class, right? So I think there's a frame of a set of problems. The United States has, I think, a very different political culture, and it's not one that's pro or anti-building things, but it's one that ultimately has been framed largely around selling a dream, right? So the United States sells a dream a lot more. It has become a nation that's been a lot more, particularly in the last 30 years, focused around its standing in the world and how it can impose its values, right? And building a military around that. At a structural level, and I think that this is probably the other thing to remember about China and the United States, is that one of the key differentiating points between the Chinese economic system institutionally is the fact that finance is publicly controlled. In the United States, it's not. So public finance, and I don't mean the central bank, I mean the policy banks, are able to provide substantial liquidity support to certain kinds of activities and objectives and take a long view. So infrastructure requires a long view, whereas in the United States, finance has evolved in a way that is a lot more focused around quarterly reports and profiting through trading of promissory notes, right? So the financialization of the United States actually, I think, has a lot more to do with the fact that it doesn't build things. Finance dances to a different tune in the United States compared to finance in China.
I'm really glad that I asked you that. So thank you for adding context because, yes, Dan Wang is his name. And he's been making the rounds on the podcast tour. And I've been listening to some of his interviews. A couple quick points to recall from that is that it's easy to reflect on maybe zero COVID or the one child policy. But that's cherry picking your indignation when you consider that over the last 30 years, 800 million people have been raised out of poverty and no country has become prosperous to that extent so quickly ever, I believe, in the history of the world. And, other evidence like the participation at the SCO just recently, over 20 members. China's influence is still growing and rapidly. And any idea that the United States does not participate in social engineering is just false. You can find recent examples like DEI, or more historic examples like eugenics, much more troubling example, and both very real. Thank you for that.